He didn't flinch when the milkshake splashed down his back. Years of discipline had taught him patience. Patience to wait, to breathe, to choose the perfect moment. The bully laughed, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear. The other inmates joined in, slapping the tables, waiting for the new guy to lose it. But he didn't move. He just stared at the white puddle dripping from his sleeve, then slowly lifted his eyes. Behind those calm, ice-blue eyes wasn't fear. It was calculation. Because this wasn't the first time someone tried to humiliate him, and the last man who did never walked again. Stay with me until the end. Because when a Navy SEAL fights back, he doesn't aim to win, he aims to end it. Before we begin, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. The concrete walls of Blackwater Correctional Facility had witnessed their fair share of violence over the decades. Fights that left men broken, alliances that shifted like sand, and power structures that rose and fell with each passing season. But nothing had prepared the inmates for what was about to unfold on that humid Tuesday morning in Cell Block C. Jake Morrison looked like any other middle-aged inmate walking through those steel doors. His graying hair was cut short. His shoulders carried the slight stoop of a man who had seen too much, and his weathered hands moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to keeping a low profile. The intake officer barely glanced up from his paperwork as he processed the new arrival. Another white-collar criminal, probably. Maybe fraud, maybe tax evasion. Nothing that would cause waves in the delicate ecosystem of prison politics. If that officer had looked closer, really studied the man standing before him, he might have noticed something different. The way Jake's eyes swept the room in calculated arcs, cataloging exits and potential threats. The way his breathing remained perfectly controlled despite being surrounded by concrete and steel. The way his posture, while relaxed, maintained a subtle readiness that spoke of years spent in places where a split second could mean the difference between life and death. Jake Morrison wasn't just another white-collar criminal. He was a retired Navy SEAL with 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and enough classified missions to fill a library. He had been a free man for 47 years, serving his country with distinction before building a successful security consulting business. Now he was prisoner number 7839, and the next 18 months of his life would be spent behind these walls for a financial crime that had spiraled out of control when his business partner embezzled funds and disappeared. The cell block Jake was assigned to operated under its own brutal hierarchy, and everyone knew who sat at the top. Vincent "Tank" Rodriguez was a mountain of a man who had turned intimidation into an art form. Standing 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing close to 300 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, Tank had built his empire through systematic violence and psychological warfare. His crew of loyal followers moved through the prison like sharks through bloody water, and the guards had learned long ago that maintaining order was easier when they let Tank handle discipline in his own savage way. Tank had earned his nickname during his 3rd year inside, when he single-handedly demolished a rival gang's attempt to move into his territory. The fight had left 2 men hospitalized, and Tank's reputation cemented in blood and broken bones. Since then, he had ruled Cell Block C with an iron fist wrapped in calculated cruelty. He decided who got protection and who became prey. He determined which inmates ate well and which went hungry. His word was law, and his enforcement was swift and merciless. When news filtered through the prison grapevine that fresh meat was arriving on the block, Tank's interest peaked immediately. New inmates represented opportunities to reinforce the pecking order, to remind everyone exactly who controlled their daily existence. Some came in scared and compliant, making the process easy. Others arrived with misplaced confidence, which made breaking them all the more satisfying. The first time Tank laid eyes on Jake Morrison, he saw exactly what he wanted to see. An older white guy, probably pushing 50, with the soft look of someone who had spent more time behind a desk than in a gym. His gray hair and lined face suggested a man who had lived comfortably, someone who had never faced real violence or understood what it meant to have everything stripped away. This wasn't just easy prey. This was a gift-wrapped opportunity to demonstrate his power in front of the entire block. Jake's first night passed without incident. He made his bunk with military precision, organized his few belongings with methodical care, and sat quietly reading a paperback novel until lights out. His cellmate, a nervous young man named Danny who was counting down the final months of a drug possession sentence, couldn't help but notice something unusual about the new arrival. Most fresh fish either came in swinging with false bravado or cowering with barely contained terror. Danny had seen both types, and he had learned to read the signs quickly. The loud ones usually got humbled fast and hard. The scared ones became victims before their first week was over. But Jake was something different entirely. He radiated a calm that seemed to come from deep within, as if he had made peace with his circumstances long before walking through those doors. "You seem different from most guys who come through here," Danny whispered after the lights went dark. "Most new arrivals either can't stop talking about their case or they're too scared to say anything at all." Jake closed his book and set it carefully on the small shelf above his bunk. "Talking about the past doesn't change it," he said quietly. "Worrying about tomorrow doesn't improve it. All we have is right now." Danny didn't fully understand what that meant, but something in the older man's voice made him feel safer than he had felt in months. There was a steadiness there, a certainty that suggested Jake Morrison had faced worse situations than this and emerged intact. The next morning brought Jake's introduction to the complex social dynamics of prison life. The cafeteria was more than just a place to eat. It was a theater where hierarchies were displayed, territories were marked, and power was demonstrated through 1,000 subtle interactions. Veterans knew which tables belonged to which groups. They understood the unspoken rules about eye contact, seating arrangements, and the delicate dance of respect and submission that kept the peace. Jake entered the cafeteria carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had marked his arrival. He moved to collect his breakfast tray, his eyes taking in the layout of the room with practiced awareness. The food was exactly what he had expected from his research about prison life. Watery eggs that had probably been sitting under heat lamps for hours, toast that had seen better days, coffee that looked like it had been brewed sometime the previous week. He accepted what was offered without complaint and began scanning for an available seat. That's when Tank decided to make his move. He had positioned himself and his crew at a central table that commanded a clear view of the entire cafeteria. It was a power position that allowed him to monitor every interaction, every conversation, every subtle shift in the room's energy. When he saw the gray-haired newcomer walking calmly with his breakfast tray, Tank knew the moment had arrived to establish the natural order of things. "Well, well, well." Tank's voice boomed across the cafeteria, causing conversations to falter and heads to turn. "Look what we got here, boys. Somebody's accountant got himself locked up with the real criminals." Jake continued walking steadily toward the tables, his tray balanced in his hands, his expression unchanged. He had encountered bullies in various forms throughout his military career and civilian life. The uniforms changed, the settings shifted, but the underlying psychology remained remarkably consistent. They fed on fear, thrived on attention, and crumbled when faced with genuine indifference. "I'm talking to you, old man," Tank continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "When somebody addresses you in here, you acknowledge them. That's basic respect, and respect is everything in this place." Jake stopped walking and turned to face Tank calmly. He had heard every word, processed the threat, and calculated his options in the span of seconds. "I heard you clearly," he replied in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard. "I was looking for a place to sit down and eat my breakfast." The response wasn't what Tank had expected. Most inmates either cowered immediately or tried to match his aggressive energy. This gray-haired man was doing neither. He was standing there completely relaxed, speaking in conversational tones, as if he were discussing the weather rather than facing down the most dangerous man in cell block C. "Your breakfast can wait," Tank growled, stepping away from his table with his crew flanking him on both sides. "See that empty spot right there?" He pointed to a section of floor near the garbage cans. "That's where new fish eat their first meal. It's tradition. Helps everyone understand how things work around here." Jake looked at the spot Tank had indicated, then back at the massive man towering over him. Around them, the cafeteria had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at their stations had noticed something happening, though they showed no signs of intervening. This was prison justice, and as long as nobody got seriously hurt, they would let the inmates sort it out themselves. "I appreciate you explaining the traditions," Jake said quietly, his voice remaining perfectly level. "But I think I'll eat at a table like everyone else." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between medieval knights. Tank's face flushed red with anger and disbelief. In 5 years of ruling this block, no one had ever refused a direct order so calmly, so completely, without fear. The old man wasn't just disrespecting him. He was making him look weak in front of everyone. Without warning, Tank reached out and knocked the breakfast tray from Jake's hands. The plastic tray clattered to the floor, spilling eggs and coffee across the concrete. The sound echoed through the silent cafeteria like a gunshot. "Oops," Tank sneered, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Looks like you dropped your breakfast, Grandpa. Better clean that up before you get yourself in real trouble." Jake looked down at the mess spreading around his feet, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Tank's gaze. For just a moment, something flickered behind those calm blue irises, something that made Tank's confident smirk falter slightly. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator that had been pretending to be prey. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as Jake bent down to pick up his fallen tray. Every eye in the cafeteria was focused on this moment, waiting to see whether the new inmate would submit or fight back. Tank's crew moved closer, sensing that backup to handle this unexpected. Their leader might neededly stubborn old man, but Jake simply collected the pieces of his scattered breakfast, straightened up, and walked calmly to the serving line to request a replacement meal. The kitchen staff, who had witnessed the entire exchange, quickly prepared another tray without being asked. They had seen this dance countless times before, and they knew better than to get caught in the middle of prison politics. As Jake carried his new breakfast to an empty table and sat down to eat, conversations slowly resumed around the cafeteria. But they were different now, hushed, careful. The power dynamic that had governed Cell Block C for years had just been publicly challenged by a gray-haired man who looked like somebody's grandfather. Tank and his crew retreated to their corner table, but the swagger was gone. They huddled together, speaking in low, urgent voices, planning their next move. Because in a place like this, what had just happened couldn't be allowed to stand. The old man had shown disrespect, and disrespect had to be answered with violence. That was the only language that mattered behind these walls. Jake ate his eggs methodically, appearing completely oblivious to the storm gathering around him, but his awareness was absolute. He could feel the hostile stares, hear the whispered conversations, sense the violence building like pressure in a steam pipe about to burst. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid, but 47 years of life had taught him that some conflicts were unavoidable. When faced with a predator, you had two choices: submit or establish dominance. Jake Morrison had never been one to submit. He had learned long ago that bullies were like wild animals. They could smell fear, fed on weakness, and only understood one language when pushed too far. After breakfast, as inmates filed out of the cafeteria toward their work assignments, several men approached Jake with cautious respect. Word had already begun to spread through the block about the newcomer who had stood up to Tank without breaking a sweat. Some offered protection, sensing that aligning themselves with someone who could face down the block's king might be wise. Others simply wanted to shake his hand, to touch a piece of whatever courage had allowed him to walk away from that confrontation unbroken. Jake politely declined all offers. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford in this place, and allies could quickly become liabilities when the violence finally erupted. As he walked back to his cell for the mandatory afternoon count, Jake knew that his quiet rebellion had set something irreversible in motion. Marcus, his cellmate Danny, whispered across the narrow space between their bunks that evening. "They're saying Tank is calling in favors from every gang in the prison. Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, even some of the black crews that usually won't work with whites. He's promising them territory, commissary money, whatever it takes." Jake lay on his narrow mattress, staring up at the ceiling where shadows danced in the dim light filtering through the corridor. He had hoped his show of backbone would be enough to earn some breathing room, but prison politics were more complicated than battlefield tactics. Here, reputation was everything, and Tank's reputation had been damaged in front of everyone. "How many men is he gathering?" Jake asked quietly. Danny's voice dropped to barely a whisper. 20, maybe. 30. All serious players with nothing to lose. Lifers, gang enforcers, guys who've been waiting for a chance to prove themselves. Jake closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had sustained him through countless dangerous missions. But for the first time since arriving at Blackwater, he felt the weight of genuine concern settling on his shoulders. 30 violent men, armed with makeshift weapons and unified by the promise of reward. Even with all his training and experience, those were odds that would challenge any warrior. The next morning brought an atmosphere so tense you could taste it in the recycled air. Guards moved with extra alertness, their hands never straying far from their batons. Conversations died abruptly when certain inmates walked by. Even the most hardened criminals seemed to sense that something explosive was building, and smart money stayed out of the way when predators prepared to clash. Jake maintained his routine with military precision. Up before the morning count, bed made with hospital corners, personal hygiene completed with methodical thoroughness. But today, he added something extra to his preparation. Hidden beneath his mattress was a small piece of metal he had carefully worked loose from his bed frame over the past several days. It wasn't much, but in the right hands, it could be the difference between walking away and being carried out. The attack came during the lunch period, when the cafeteria was packed and the guards were spread thin across multiple responsibilities. Tank had chosen his moment perfectly, waiting until Jake was isolated out of the room with a table in the center, no easy escape routes. It started with the milkshake. Jake was halfway through his meal when he felt the cold liquid splash across his back and shoulders. The vanilla shake soaked through his orange jumpsuit, dripping onto the floor in thick white puddles that would make footing treacherous. Around him, the cafeteria erupted in laughter and jeers as Tank's crew celebrated the opening move of their carefully orchestrated humiliation. He didn't flinch when the milkshake splashed down his back. Years of discipline had taught him patience. Patience to wait, to breathe, to choose the perfect moment. The bully laughed, loud enough for the whole cafeteria to hear. The other inmates joined in, slapping the tables, waiting for the new guy to lose it. But he didn't move. He just stared at the white puddle dripping from his sleeve, then slowly lifted his eyes. Behind those calm, ice-blue eyes wasn't fear. It was calculation. "Look at that," Tank boomed, his voice carrying across the entire room. "Old man's so scared he can't even turn around to face me. Maybe prison life is too tough for soft civilian types." Jake slowly wiped Milkshake from his hands with a napkin, his movements deliberate and controlled. He could hear Tank approaching from behind, heavy footsteps accompanied by the shuffle of multiple followers. The entire cafeteria held its collective breath, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "I said turn around when I'm talking to you," Tank snarled, grabbing Jake's shoulder and spinning him forcefully on the bench. That's when Jake moved. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that left witnesses struggling to process what they had seen. Jake's hand shot upward in a blur of motion, his fingers finding the exact pressure point on Tank's wrist that would cause his grip to release involuntarily. The big man's hand opened like he had been shocked, his confident expression shifting to confusion in the span of a heartbeat. Before Tank could react, Jake was on his feet and moving. His elbow drove upward into Tank's solar plexus with surgical accuracy, targeting the cluster of nerves that would disrupt breathing and muscle control. Tank doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. The first of Tank's crew rushed forward, swinging a sock filled with batteries in a vicious arc toward Jake's head. But Jake wasn't there when the weapon arrived. He had slipped inside the attacker's reach, his palm striking upward in a move that connected with the man's chin and sent him sprawling backward into a table that collapsed under his weight. Two more attackers came from different directions, trying to overwhelm him with coordinated assault. Jake moved between them like smoke, his training taking over completely. A knee strike dropped one man to the floor, clutching his ribs. A precise chokehold rendered the other unconscious in less than 3 seconds. The cafeteria erupted into chaos as other inmates scrambled for exits or dove under tables to avoid the violence. Guards rushed in from multiple entrances, their riot gear clattering as they moved to contain what looked like a full-scale uprising. But when the dust settled, only one man was still standing. Jake stood in the center of the destruction, his breathing slightly elevated but otherwise composed. Around him lay Tank and 4 of his most trusted enforcers, all of them groaning or unconscious. The milkshake that had started the confrontation was now mixed with blood on the concrete floor, creating an abstract pattern that spoke to the sudden reversal of fortune. Tank struggled to his knees, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. The man he had targeted as easy prey had just systematically dismantled his entire crew in less than 30 seconds. Worse, he had done it in front of everyone, destroying Tank's carefully cultivated reputation with the efficiency of a precision strike. "What are you?" Tank wheezed, clutching his chest where Jake's elbow had found its mark. Jake looked down at the fallen king of Cell Block C with something that might have been pity. "I'm someone who just wanted to eat his lunch in peace," he said calmly. "But I'm also someone who learned a long time ago that respect isn't given. It's earned." As guards surrounded him with weapons drawn, Jake raised his hands slowly and submitted to their authority without resistance. He had sent the message he needed to send, and now he would face the consequences. Solitary confinement was a small price to pay for ensuring that the remainder of his sentence would be served without constant harassment. But the real impact of what had happened wouldn't be felt until later, when word spread through every cell block in the prison. The gray-haired newcomer wasn't just dangerous, he was lethal. And Tank Rodriguez, the man who had ruled through fear and violence for 5 years, had been brought low by someone who looked like he should be coaching Little League baseball. As Jake was led away in shackles, he caught sight of Danny watching from the crowd of inmates pressed against the cafeteria windows. The young man's eyes were wide with amazement and something that looked like hope. For the first time in months, Danny realized that bullies weren't invincible. They were just men, and men could be beaten. The ripple effects of that afternoon would reshape the power structure of Blackwater Correctional Facility in ways no one could have predicted. But that story was still being written, one careful move at a time. The aftermath of the cafeteria incident sent shockwaves through every corner of Blackwater Correctional Facility. Within hours, the story had been retold, embellished, and transformed into legend. A gray-haired newcomer had single-handedly destroyed Tank Rodriguez and his entire crew in less time than it took most men to finish their lunch. But legends, Jake knew from experience, could be more dangerous than reality. Solitary confinement was an 8x10 concrete box designed to break men's spirits through isolation and sensory deprivation. Most inmates emerged from the hole either completely submissive or mentally shattered. But Jake used the 72 hours of silence to do what he had always done in difficult situations. He planned. The concrete walls couldn't contain the ripple effects of what had happened. Word traveled through the prison's underground communication network with lightning speed. Tank Rodriguez, the man who had ruled Cell Block C through systematic brutality, had been publicly humiliated by someone who looked like he belonged in a retirement community rather than maximum security. But Jake understood prison politics better than most. His display of force hadn't solved the problem. It had escalated it to a level that would require much more than martial arts training to survive. When the steel door finally opened and Jake stepped back into general population, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Hardened criminals who had never shown fear to anyone stepped aside to let him pass. Even the guards treated him with a cautious respect that hadn't existed before his arrival. Danny was waiting in their cell, pacing nervously between the bunks like a caged animal. The young man's face showed a mixture of relief and terror that spoke volumes about what had been happening during Jake's absence. "Man, I thought they might never let you out," Danny whispered as Jake settled onto his narrow bunk. "The whole place has been going crazy since what happened in the cafeteria. Tank's been in the infirmary, but his people are talking about bringing in outside help." Jake nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had expected. Prison hierarchies didn't collapse quietly. When a king fell, the resulting power vacuum created chaos that could tear an entire facility apart. And Tank's humiliation had been too public, too complete, for him to simply accept defeat and fade into obscurity. "What kind of outside help?" Jake asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Danny's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They're saying he's reached out to connections from other prisons, guys who owe him favors from back in the day. Professional killers who don't care hard time because about doing, they're already serving life sentences." The news confirmed Jake's worst fears. Tank wasn't just gathering local muscle for another confrontation. He was importing genuine killers, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from eliminating the threat to his reputation. This wasn't going to be a prison fight. It was going to be an execution. "How many men is he bringing in?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Nobody knows for sure," Danny replied. "But the guards have been extra tense. They're doing more counts, searching cells randomly. Something big is coming, and everyone can feel it." Jake lay back on his thin mattress and stared at the ceiling where water stains created abstract patterns in the dim light. 47 years of life had taught him that some battles were inevitable, no matter how much you tried to avoid them. The question wasn't whether Tank would come for him. The question was when, where, and with how much force. That night, as the cell block settled into its usual rhythm of whispered conversations and restless sleep, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Chen, a soft-spoken Asian man who had been serving a white-collar sentence in relative anonymity, appeared at their cell door during the evening recreation period. Marcus had always kept to himself, avoiding the gangs and politics that dominated prison life. He spent his days in the library, his evenings writing letters to family, and his weekends playing chess with other quiet inmates who preferred intellectual pursuits to physical confrontation. But something about Jake's situation had drawn him into the open. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "What you did to Tank has made life easier for guys like me, the ones who aren't part of any crew." Jake studied the smaller man carefully. In his experience, gratitude in prison usually came with strings attached. People didn't approach dangerous situations without wanting something in return. "I appreciate that," Jake replied, "but I wasn't trying to help anyone. I was just trying to eat my breakfast." Marcus smiled slightly at the response. "That's exactly why it mattered. You didn't do it for power or respect or territory. You did it because it was right. And that's something this place hasn't seen in a long time." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the corridor. Three Jake didn't recognize were walking purposefully toward their section of the block. They moved with the predatory confidence of professional violence, their eyes scanning the cells like hunters tracking prey. "New arrivals," Marcus whispered, stepping back into the shadows. They came in on the transfer bus this afternoon. Word is their tank's insurance policy. Jake watched the three men as they passed, cataloging details with the automatic precision of his military training. The leader was a tall, lean man with intricate tattoos covering his arms and neck. His movements spoke of someone comfortable with violence, someone who had made killing a career, rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. The second man was shorter but broader, with the thick build of someone who had spent decades turning his body into a weapon. Scars crisscrossed his knuckles and forearms, telling stories of countless fights won through brute force and determination. The third member of the group was perhaps the most dangerous. He was average height and build, unremarkable in every way except for his eyes. They held the flat, empty stare of someone who felt no empathy, no remorse, no connection to the humanity of others. Jake had seen that look before, in war zones and black sites where the rules of civilization didn't apply. Tanks bringing in professionals, Jake said quietly, as the three men disappeared around the corner. This isn't going to be a prison fight anymore. Marcus nodded gravely. The guards know something's coming. They've been doing surprise cell searches, looking for weapons. But guys like that don't need weapons. They are weapons. Over the following days, the tension in cell block C became almost unbearable. Conversations died when the wrong people walked by. Men who had survived decades behind bars suddenly looked nervous, glancing over their shoulders and avoiding eye contact with anyone connected to the brewing conflict. Jake maintained his routine with military discipline, but he also began preparing for war. The small piece of metal he had worked loose from his bed frame became the foundation for something more substantial. Using techniques learned in survival training, he fashioned a simple but effective weapon from materials that wouldn't trigger metal detectors or raise suspicions during random searches. More importantly, he began studying the patterns of his enemies. Tank's new allies moved through the prison with arrogant confidence, but confidence could become carelessness. They followed predictable routes, gathered at specific times, and displayed the kind of casual disregard for security that professional soldiers learned to exploit. The attack came on a Thursday morning, during the shift change between day and evening guards. It was a carefully chosen moment when supervision was at its lightest and response times were longest. Jake was in the laundry room, fulfilling his work assignment, when the door suddenly slammed shut behind him. He turned to find all four men blocking his exit. Tank stood at the back, his face still bearing the bruises from their previous encounter. The three professionals arranged themselves in a semicircle, cutting off any possible escape route. "Well, well," Tank said, his voice carrying a mixture of satisfaction and barely controlled rage. "Look who we have here. The tough guy who thinks he can embarrass me in front of the whole block." Jake set down the laundry basket he had been carrying and faced his attackers with the same calm that had characterized every moment since his arrival. The laundry room was small, cramped, filled with industrial washing machines that limited movement and created blind spots. It was a perfect killing ground for men who knew their business. 4 against 1, Jake observed quietly. "I'm flattered that you think I'm worth that much trouble." The tall man with the tattoos stepped forward, a crude knife gleaming in his hand. The weapon had been fashioned from a piece of sharpened metal, probably taken from the machine shop and honed to razor sharpness in some hidden corner of the prison. "Nothing personal, old man," the killer said, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "But Tank here has promised us some very valuable considerations in exchange for your removal from the equation." Jake's eyes tracked the positions of all four men, calculating distances, angles, and timing with the precision of a computer. The scarred man was moving to flank him from the left. The empty-eyed killer was circling right. Tank remained near the door, content to watch his hired muscle work. This was the moment Jake had been preparing for since the Milkshake incident. Not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. He had faced overwhelming odds before, in places where failure meant not just death, but the death of innocent people depending on him to complete the mission. The first attacker moved with professional speed, his knife cutting through the air in a pattern designed to disable rather than kill immediately. But Jake wasn't there when the blade arrived. He had dropped low and rolled sideways, coming up behind one of the washing machines that provided temporary cover. The scarred man rushed to flank him, swinging a makeshift club with enough force to crush bone. Jake caught the weapon mid-swing, twisted sharply, and heard the satisfying crack of breaking wrist. The club clattered to the floor as its owner collapsed, screaming, 2 down, 3 to go. The tattooed leader had anticipated Jake's movement and positioned himself to cut off the escape route. His knife work was professional, precise, designed to herd his target into a corner where numbers would overwhelm skill Jake had spent. But years fighting in close quarters against multiple opponents who wanted him dead. He feinted left, drew the knife thrust, then stepped inside the attacker's reach. His elbow found the man's throat with surgical precision, crushing the windpipe and dropping him to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The empty-eyed killer moved with mechanical efficiency, producing a second weapon from somewhere in his clothing. This one was different, more sophisticated. A piece of sharpened steel wrapped with electrical tape to provide grip. It spoke of experience, of previous kills completed successfully. "You're better than advertised," the killer said conversationally as he advanced. "But everyone dies eventually, even Navy SEALs." The words confirmed what Jake had suspected. These weren't random prison muscle hired for a simple beating. They were professionals who had researched their target, learned his background, and planned accordingly. This was an assassination disguised as a prison fight. Jake backed toward the rear of the laundry room, where the industrial dryers created a maze of metal obstacles and blind corners. The killer followed patiently, his weapon held low and ready, his movements speaking of someone who had done this many times before. The final confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but those seconds contained a lifetime of training, experience, and determination. Jake used the environment to his advantage, turning the killer's precision against him. A feint drew the weapon thrust. A pivot avoided the blade. A counterstrike found its target with the kind of accuracy that separated professionals from amateurs. When the violence ended, 3 men lay unconscious or worse on the laundry room floor. Tank stood pressed against the door, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. The man he had brought professionals to eliminate was standing calmly in the center of the destruction, barely breathing hard. "Your turn," Jake said quietly, taking a step forward. Tank's courage evaporated completely. The man who had ruled through intimidation and violence suddenly found himself face to face with someone who operated on an entirely different level. He scrambled for the door handle, his hands shaking as he tried to escape the room that had become a tomb for his hired killers. "Wait," Tank gasped as Jake approached. "This doesn't have to end this way. We can work something out. Territory, commissary money, whatever you want." Jake stopped just out of arm's reach, his ice-blue eyes studying the fallen king with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "What I want," Jake said slowly, "is to serve my time in peace. But you've made that impossible. So now we're going to establish some new rules." The sound of approaching boots echoed through the corridor as guards finally responded to the disturbance. Jake stepped back and raised his hands, submitting to their authority, as he had after the cafeteria incident. But this time, everyone understood that the power structure of Blackwater Correctional Facility had shifted permanently. Tank Rodriguez was no longer the king of Cell Block C. That title now belonged to a gray-haired man who looked like someone's grandfather, but fought like a force of nature. The ripple effects of the laundry room incident would reshape every aspect of life in the prison, but those consequences were still unfolding, one careful decision at a time. The news of what happened in the laundry room spread through Blackwater like wildfire through dry grass. By evening count, every inmate in the facility knew that Tank Rodriguez had brought in professional killers to handle his Navy SEAL problem. and all three of those professionals were now in the infirmary. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. Jake Morrison had faced overwhelming odds and emerged victorious once again. But victory in prison came with a price that extended far beyond solitary confinement. Jake sat in his 8x10 concrete cell, listening to the whispered conversations echoing through the corridors, and understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer just another inmate serving his time quietly. He had become a legend, and legends attracted attention from people who should remain in the shadows. The warden arrived at Jake's cell on the third day of his isolation, flanked by 2 guards and wearing an expression that mixed professional concern with genuine curiosity. Warden Patricia Hayes had run Blackwater for 12 years, and she had seen every type of inmate the system could produce. Gang leaders, serial killers, white-collar criminals, and everything in between. But Jake Morrison represented something she had never encountered before. "Mr. Morrison," she said, settling into the single chair that had been brought into the narrow space. "We need to talk." Jake looked up from the book he had been reading, a philosophy text that Danny had managed to slip him through the prison's underground network. His expression remained calm, respectful, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he had been expecting this conversation. "Ma'am," he replied simply, closing the book and giving her his full attention. Warden Hayes studied him for a long moment, taking in the gray hair, the lined face, the posture that somehow managed to convey both relaxation and readiness. "According to your file, you're here for financial crimes, tax evasion, failure to report income. Nothing that would suggest you're capable of what happened in that laundry room." Jake nodded slowly. "People aren't always what they appear to be, ma'am. Prison has a way of bringing out sides of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden." The warden leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Mr. Morrison, I've been running this facility for over a decade. I've seen riots, gang wars, murders, and every form of violence you can imagine. But I've never seen anything like what you did to those 3 men. 2 of them are still unconscious. The third may never regain full use of his right arm." Jake's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Self-defense isn't a crime. Even in here, they came at me with weapons. I did what I had to do to survive." "That's exactly what concerns me," Warden Hayes replied. "Because according to the security footage, you didn't just survive. You systematically neutralized 3 professional killers with your bare hands in less than 15 seconds. That level of skill doesn't come from weekend self-defense classes." The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats. Jake understood that this was a pivotal moment, a decision point that would determine how the remainder of his sentence would unfold. He could continue to maintain the fiction that he was just another white-collar criminal who got lucky. Or he could trust the woman sitting across from him with enough truth to potentially save lives. "I served my country for 23 years, Jake said finally. "Some of that service involved situations that required specialized training, but I never wanted to use those skills in here. I came to do my time quietly and go home to rebuild my life." Warden Hayes nodded slowly, processing this information. "Your military records are sealed at a level that requires federal clearance to access. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of service you provided. The question now is what we do about the situation you've created." "I didn't create anything," Jake replied quietly. "I responded to threats against my life. If Tank Rodriguez and his people had left me alone, none of this would have happened." The warden stood and walked to the small window that provided the cell's only natural light. Outside, the prison yard was visible, along with the guard towers that watched over everything with mechanical precision. "Mr. Morrison, what you don't understand is that your actions have upset a balance that took years to establish. Tank Rodriguez wasn't just a bully. He was a pressure valve that kept this place from exploding. The gangs respected his authority. The guards used him to maintain order, and the violence stayed contained within predictable parameters." Jake considered this perspective carefully. He had spent enough time in military command positions to understand the delicate ecosystems that developed in closed environments. Sometimes stability, even brutal stability, was preferable to chaos. What happens now? He asked. Now we have a power vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Every gang leader, every ambitious sociopath, every violent predator in this facility is going to see an opportunity to claim Tank's territory. The next few weeks are going to be the most dangerous in Blackwater's history. The warden turned back to face him, her expression grave. Unless we can find a way to fill that vacuum with someone who has both the respect of the inmates and the wisdom to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Jake understood immediately what she was suggesting, and the implications made his stomach turn. You want me to become the new king of the castle, to take Tank the hierarchy. I want you to consider the alternative, Warden Hayes replied. Without strong leadership, this place will tear itself apart. Good men like your cellmate Danny will get caught in the crossfire. Guards will get hurt. The violence will escalate until we have to call in riot teams and lock down the entire facility for months. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of running feet in the corridor outside. One of the guards who had accompanied the warden appeared at the cell door, his face flushed with urgency. Ma'am, we've got a situation developing in cell block B. 3 different gangs are mobilizing their people. It looks like they're preparing to make a move on Rodriguez's territory while he's still in the infirmary. Warden Hayes sighed heavily, the weight of command visible in her shoulders. How long until they clash? Maybe an hour, ma'am, 2 at the outside. The guards are requesting permission to initiate lockdown procedures. Jake stood slowly, his mind racing through the possibilities and consequences. Lockdown would mean 24-hour isolation for every inmate, suspended privileges, canceled visits, and an atmosphere of tension that could last for months. It would punish everyone for the actions of a few, and it would solve nothing in the long term. Ma'am, Jake said quietly, there might be another way. The warden looked at him sharply. What are you suggesting? Let me talk to them. Not as their new leader, but as someone who understands what they're really fighting about. Sometimes violence can be prevented with the right conversation at the right moment. Absolutely not, the guard interjected. Sir, with all due respect, putting you in the middle of a gang war would be suicide. These aren't playground bullies. These are killers who see you as either a threat or an opportunity. Jake's expression remained calm, but there was something in his voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to command decisions. I've walked into hostile situations before. Sometimes the best way to prevent a war is to show up unarmed and start talking. Warden Hayes studied his face for a long moment, weighing options that all carried significant risks. Finally, she made her decision. Against my better judgment, I'm going to give you a chance, but you'll have guards nearby. And at the first sign of violence, we extract you and initiate full lockdown. Understood? Understood, ma'am, Jake replied. 20 minutes later, Jake walked into the main corridor of cell block B surrounded by more tension than he had felt since his deployment days. The 3 gang factions had taken positions at strategic points throughout the block, their members armed with improvised weapons and radiating the kind of focused aggression that preceded bloodshed. The Aryan Brotherhood controlled the north end, led by a massive skinhead named Kruger, whose arms were covered in white supremacist tattoos. The Mexican Mafia held the center section, under the command of a soft-spoken but deadly man called El Jefe. The black gangs had unified under Marcus Washington, an intelligent and ruthless leader who had been orchestrating their expansion for months. All 3 groups went silent when Jake appeared, flanked by guards who looked ready to draw weapons at the slightest provocation. The gray-haired man who had destroyed Tank Rodriguez walked calmly down the center of the corridor, seemingly oblivious to the dozens of hostile eyes tracking his every movement. Gentlemen, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the concrete space. I understand there's been some confusion about territorial arrangements since recent events. I thought we might talk about it before anyone does something they can't take back. Kruger stepped forward, a crude knife visible in his massive fist. You got some balls coming here, old man. But balls don't stop steel, and you just walked into the wrong neighborhood. Jake turned to face the Aryan leader directly, his expression remaining completely calm despite the obvious threat. I walked in here to prevent a war that's going to hurt everyone, including people who have nothing to do with your business. But if you'd rather settle this with violence, I'm prepared for that too. The words carried a quiet confidence that made even Kruger hesitate. This wasn't the bravado of someone trying to bluff his way out of trouble. This was the certainty of someone who had calculated the odds and found them acceptable. El Jefe spoke up from his position near the center of the block, his voice carrying a slight accent and the kind of measured tone that suggested careful consideration of every word. The Navy SEAL thinks he can walk in here and dictate terms to organizations that have existed long before he arrived and will exist long after he's gone. Jake nodded respectfully toward the Mexican leader. You're absolutely right. I have no authority here. No crew, no territory to defend. I'm just someone who's seen what happens when good men get caught in wars they didn't start, and I'm hoping we can find a solution that doesn't require anyone to die today. Marcus Washington laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You took out Tank and his professionals, so now you think you can play peacemaker? This ain't about you, old man. This is about power, territory, and respect that goes back years. Jake understood that he was walking a tightrope over an abyss. One wrong word, one perceived insult, and the corridor would erupt into violence that would leave bodies scattered across the concrete. But he also understood that these men, despite their criminal backgrounds, were fundamentally rational actors who responded to strength and respected competence. You're right, Jake said, addressing all three leaders simultaneously. This isn't about me, but it is about what happens to this place if you tear it apart, fighting over scraps. Tank kept a brutal peace, but it was still peace. Without that, everyone suffers. Guards crack down harder. Privileges get suspended. Visits get canceled. The administration brings in outside contractors who don't know the difference between a gang his time quietly. The three leader and a guy just trying to serve men exchanged glances, each calculating whether the others were buying into Jake's argument. They were predators, but they were also survivors who understood that sometimes cooperation served their interests better than conflict. What are you proposing? El Jefe asked carefully. Jake took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine whether he walked out of this corridor or got carried out. I'm proposing that you divide Tank's territory between the three of you, but you do it through negotiation rather than warfare. Each crew gets something they want. Nobody has to worry about watching their back every second, and the administration doesn't have an excuse to crack down on everyone. Kruger spat on the concrete floor, his expression contemptuous. And what makes you think we need your permission for anything, SEAL boy? Maybe we just take what we want and add your scalp to the collection. Because, Jake replied quietly, looking directly into the big man's eyes. You've seen what I can do when someone forces my hand. And because starting a war in here means everyone loses except the people who run this place. They get overtime pay for the guards, federal funding for the lockdowns, and excuses to cut programs that make your time easier to serve. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as the three leaders considered his words. Finally, Marcus Washington stepped forward, his intelligent eyes studying Jake with newfound respect. You make sense, old man, but respect ain't something you can just talk your way into. If you want to broker peace between us, you gotta show us you can handle the responsibility that comes with that kind of influence. Jake nodded slowly, understanding that he was being tested. What did you have in mind? There's a problem that needs solving, Washington continued. Someone's been stealing from commissary deliveries. Money's going missing. Supplies are getting diverted. Tank was supposed to handle it, but Tank's not available anymore. You want to play peacemaker? Prove you can deliver justice when it's needed. The challenge was clear. Jake was being asked to step into the role of arbiter, to investigate and resolve a problem that affected all three gangs. It was a test of his capabilities and his willingness to make the hard decisions that came with leadership in this environment. I'll look into it, Jake said. But I need something from all of you in return. No moves against each other's territory until I've had a chance to sort this out. And when I do find out who's been stealing, you accept my judgment on how to handle it. The three leaders exchanged another round of glances, each weighing the risks and benefits of this unexpected proposal. Finally, El Jefe nodded slowly. 1 week, he said. You have 7 days to prove you can handle this kind of responsibility. But if you fail, or if you try to play favorites, the deal is off, and we settle things the old way. Agreed, Jake replied, knowing that he had just accepted a burden that could easily get him killed. But as he walked back toward his cell under the watchful eyes of dozens of inmates, he also knew that he had potentially prevented a bloodbath that would have destroyed countless lives. The real work was just beginning. The investigation began at dawn, when most inmates were still lost in whatever dreams prison walls allowed them to have. Jake moved through the corridors with purposeful silence, his trained eyes cataloging details that others would miss. 23 years of military service had taught him that most problems weren't solved through violence. They were solved through patience, observation, and understanding the human weaknesses that created opportunities for exploitation. The commissary operation at Blackwater was more complex than most outsiders realized. Every week, trucks delivered thousands of dollars worth of supplies that represented the difference between surviving and living for the men locked behind these walls. Cigarettes, instant coffee, candy bars, soap, writing materials, small luxuries that became precious commodities in a world stripped of comfort and choice. When those supplies went missing, it wasn't just theft. It was an attack on the delicate economy that kept the prison functioning. Jake's first stop was the loading dock, where deliveries arrived every Tuesday and Friday. The area was controlled by a work crew of trustees, inmates who had earned enough respect and demonstrated enough reliability to handle the movement of valuable goods. The supervisor was a guard named Officer Martinez, a 20-year veteran who had seen every SC and hustle the prison population scheme could devise. Martinez looked up from his clipboard as Jake approached, his expression shifting from routine boredom to cautious attention. Word had traveled through the staff about the new inmate who had dismantled Tank Rodriguez's entire operation single-handedly. Even the guards treated Jake differently now, with the kind of wary respect usually reserved for dangerous animals that might be temporarily contained but were never truly tamed. "Morrison," Martinez said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood that prison politics extended far beyond the inmates. "Heard you're looking into our supply situation. That's unusual for someone who's supposed to be in solitary." "Warden Hayes gave me permission to investigate the missing inventory," Jake replied calmly. "I'm trying to prevent a war between the gangs over territory that might not even exist if this problem down his clipboard and studied Jake more gets solved quietly." Martinez sat carefully. In his 2 decades at Blackwater, he had learned to read men quickly and accurately. Survival depended on understanding who could be trusted, who posed a threat, and who might be useful in maintaining the precarious balance that kept the facility from exploding into chaos. "The missing supplies are real enough," Martinez admitted. "We've been documenting shortages for the past 6 weeks. Coffee, cigarettes, hygiene products, always the high-value items that move fast in the underground economy. But catching the thief is harder than you might think." Jake nodded, understanding the complexities involved. Prison theft wasn't like civilian crime, where forensic evidence and surveillance cameras could provide clear answers. Here, loyalty was currency, silence was survival, and everyone had reasons to avoid cooperation with official investigations. "Who has access to the supplies between delivery and distribution?" Jake asked, pulling out a small notebook he had acquired through the prison's underground trading network. Martinez glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then moved closer to Jake. "The delivery crew unloads the trucks. My trustees move everything to the storage area. The commissary staff inventories and shelves the products. Then inmates can purchase items during designated hours. That's at least 15 people who handled the merchandise at various points. 15 suspects with opportunity. But Jake understood that opportunity alone didn't create thieves. There had to be motivation, method, and most importantly, a way to convert stolen goods into something valuable within the prison economy. In the military, he had learned that following the money usually led to the truth, even when that money took unusual forms. What happens to inventory that gets damaged or spoiled during handling? Jake asked, making notes in his careful handwriting. Standard procedure is to document it and dispose of it according to regulations, Martinez replied. But damaged goods don't usually include cigarettes and coffee. Those are pretty hard to accidentally destroy. Jake spent the next hour walking through the entire supply chain, from the loading dock to the commissary shelves, mapping out every checkpoint where products changed hands. His military training had included logistics and supply chain security, skills that translated perfectly to this civilian environment. Every system had vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities were usually human rather than mechanical. The trustees who moved supplies from the dock to storage were an interesting group. All of them had been selected for reliability and good behavior, but they also had access to valuable merchandise during the brief window when it was most vulnerable to theft. Jake made note of their names and began building profiles based on conversations with other inmates and observations patterns. Tommy Chen was a of their behavior quiet man, serving time for embezzlement, who kept to himself and seemed focused on earning early release through exemplary conduct. Maria Santos was one of the few female trustees, serving a sentence for drug trafficking but maintaining a spotless prison record. Big Jim Morrison, no relation despite the shared surname, was a mountain of a man doing time for armed robbery who had found religion and spent his free time mentoring younger inmates. Each of them had opportunity, but Jake was looking for something more specific. The thief wasn't just taking random items. They were selecting high-value products that moved quickly in the underground economy. That suggested knowledge of prison commerce and connections to buyers who could move stolen merchandise without attracting attention. Jake's investigation took him next to the commissary itself, where inmates lined up twice a week to spend their limited funds on items that made prison life marginally more bearable. The operation was run by Mrs. Patterson, a civilian employee who had worked at Blackwater for 8 years and commanded respect from both staff and inmates through her combination of fairness and firmness. "Mr. Morrison," she said, as Jake approached her desk during the quiet period between commissary hours. "Officer Martinez said you might have questions about our inventory situation. I have to say, it's refreshing to see someone taking this seriously, instead of just writing it off as the cost of doing business." Jake settled into the chair across from her desk, his notebook ready. "How long have you been noticing discrepancies between what gets delivered and what makes it to the shelves?" Mrs. Patterson pulled out a manila folder thick with documentation. "It started about 6 weeks ago, small amounts at first. A few packs of cigarettes, some instant coffee, personal hygiene items. I thought it might be clerical errors or damaged goods not being properly documented, but the pattern has been getting more obvious." She spread several inventory sheets across her desk, pointing to highlighted discrepancies. "Look at this. We received 200 packs of cigarettes on Tuesday. By Friday, we only had 163 available for sale. That's 37 packs that disappeared somewhere in the process." Jake studied the numbers, looking for patterns that might reveal the method behind the theft. The missing quantities were significant but not enormous, suggesting someone who understood the importance of staying below the threshold that would trigger intensive investigation. "Who has access to your inventory between the time it arrives from storage and when you put it on the shelves?" Jake asked. "3 commissary workers and myself," Mrs. Patterson replied. "All of them are longtime employees with clean records. I've worked with these people for years, and I can't believe any of them would risk their jobs for cigarettes and coffee." But Jake had learned that desperation and opportunity could turn honest people into thieves faster than anyone expected. Financial problems, family emergencies, Addiction issues, blackmail. There were countless reasons why someone might compromise their principles, even people who seemed above suspicion. Can I get a list of your workers and their schedules for the past 6 weeks? Jake requested. And any documentation about who was working on the days when significant shortages occurred. Mrs. Patterson hesitated for a moment, understanding that she was potentially providing ammunition that could destroy careers and lives. But the theft was threatening the stability of the entire commissary operation, and stability in prison was a precious commodity that couldn't be taken for granted. I can get you that information, she said finally, but I want your word that you'll be fair in your investigation. These are good people who work hard in a difficult environment. If someone made a mistake or got pressured into something, I hope you'll consider that before making judgments. Jake nodded respectfully. Justice isn't about punishment, Mrs. Patterson. It's about understanding why things happen and preventing them from happening again. I'm not looking to destroy anyone's life over stolen cigarettes. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks like they don't belong there. Jake Morrison walked into Blackwater Correctional Facility, looking like someone's grandfather, but he walked out having reshaped an entire system through quiet strength and calculated action. The milkshake that Tank Rodriguez thought would break him became the catalyst for something no one saw coming. From that first moment when Jake refused to eat on the floor to his final investigation that prevented a gang war, he proved that true power doesn't come from fear or violence. It comes from discipline, wisdom, and the courage to stand up when standing up matters most. The inmates learned that respect isn't taken by force. It's earned through character. And sometimes, the best way to end a fight is to show your enemy that you're prepared for whatever comes next, but you'd rather find another way. What would you have done in Jake's position? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that subscribe button. And remember that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you can endure and still choose to do what's right.